Rebecca, you have to. And dance.
Thomas, please, just go.
But one question remains. Could anyone have stopped him from the very beginning? Now, we rewind time. Obsession, infidelity, and ultimately death. In the serene coastal town of Clearwater Bay, the brutal slaying of Rebecca Hart shattered the tranquility that residents had long cherished. What seemed like an ordinary beachside community, concealing nothing more sinister than neighborly gossip, became the backdrop for a crime fueled by jealousy, manipulation, and forbidden desire. The intertwined lives of two families, the Chambers and the Harts, would spiral into obsession and violence, revealing that even the most picturesque settings can harbor the darkest of secrets. Thomas Chambers was a prominent real estate developer known throughout Clearwater Bay for his charisma and business acumen. His wife, Catherine, worked as a nurse at the local hospital and was admired for her compassion and dedication. Eric Hart, a corporate attorney, and his wife Rebecca, a talented interior designer, moved to Clearwater Bay 3 years prior and quickly became inseparable friends with the Chambers. The two couples shared countless dinners, beach outings, and holiday celebrations, their bond seemingly unbreakable. The unconventional arrangement began innocuously enough during a boozy summer evening on the Chambers' deck overlooking the ocean. Fueled by margaritas and an air of spontaneity, the conversation drifted toward the topic of monogamy and alternative relationships. To everyone's surprise, the idea of experimenting with partner swapping was met with intrigue rather than rejection. Over the following weeks, the concept was explored more thoroughly, with all four agreeing to strict boundaries designed to protect their marriages and friendships. The first exchange was tentative but exhilarating. Thomas and Rebecca, alongside Eric and Catherine, swapped partners for an evening that left them breathless with anticipation and curiosity. What started as an occasional indulgence evolved into a regular pattern, injecting excitement into both marriages. For a time, the arrangement seemed to enhance their connections, bringing a renewed energy to their relationships. They continued their social routines, hosting elaborate parties and taking luxurious vacations together, all while guarding their secret from the outside world. However, as months turned into a year, subtle shifts began to emerge in Thomas's demeanor. He developed an unusual fixation on Rebecca, engineering opportunities to be alone with her and showing an intensity that went beyond their agreed-upon arrangement. Catherine noticed his preoccupation, but initially dismissed it as harmless enthusiasm. Eric, trusting and oblivious, failed to detect the brewing tension. Unbeknownst to the others, Thomas's interest in Rebecca was transforming into something far more dangerous, an obsession that would consume him entirely. Thomas found himself unable to stop thinking about Rebecca. During business meetings, his mind wandered to their encounters. At home with Catherine, he became distant and irritable, his thoughts perpetually drifting to Rebecca's laugh, her mannerisms, the way she looked at him. He began volunteering for tasks that would bring him into Rebecca's orbit, offering to help with design projects and finding excuses to visit the Hart residence even when Eric wasn't home. Catherine's initial dismissal of Thomas's behavior turned to concern as the pattern intensified. She noticed how his eyes followed Rebecca during gatherings, how his conversations always circled back to her. One night, after a dinner party, Catherine confronted him, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. Thomas responded defensively, accusing her of jealousy and overreacting. Catherine, not wanting to fracture the delicate equilibrium they had established, backed down but remained watchful. Rebecca began sensing Thomas's growing fixation as well. What had started as flattering attention became increasingly uncomfortable. His touches lingered too long, his compliments became too personal, and his presence felt suffocating. She confided in Eric, who dismissed her concerns, insisting that Thomas was simply more affectionate by nature. Eric's casual attitude left Rebecca feeling isolated and vulnerable. The situation reached a critical point during a weekend getaway to a lakeside resort. The couples had planned the trip to reconnect and escape their daily routines, but it only served to highlight Thomas's unhealthy attachment. He monopolized Rebecca's time, insisting they take boat rides alone and excluding Eric and Catherine from their activities. The tension was palpable, and Rebecca's attempts to create distance were met with passive-aggressive resistance from Thomas. One evening by the bonfire, Thomas made a statement that crossed every boundary. He spoke about them running away together, leaving their spouses, and starting fresh in a place where no one knew them. Rebecca, horrified and shaken, excused herself and retreated to her room. Catherine, who had overheard the exchange, confronted Thomas once again. This time, his denial was less convincing, and Catherine realized the depth of his obsession was far worse than she had imagined. Despite Catherine's interventions, Thomas's behavior spiraled further out of control. He began following Rebecca outside their arranged meetings, appearing at her design studio unannounced, and showing up at her morning yoga classes under flimsy pretenses. Rebecca's discomfort evolved into genuine fear. She confided in a trusted colleague who advised her to sever ties with Thomas immediately and consider involving the authorities if his behavior continued. Determined to reclaim control of her life, Rebecca decided to end the arrangement completely. She hoped that by doing so, Thomas would accept reality and they could all move forward without further damage. One afternoon, while Eric was traveling for work, Thomas appeared at her door. Rebecca, though apprehensive, allowed him inside, hoping to handle the conversation calmly and definitively. They sat in her living room, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken dread. Thomas poured out his feelings, speaking of a future where they could be together openly and honestly. Rebecca, fighting to maintain her composure, tried to reason with him, explaining that their arrangement had always been temporary and recreational, never meant to evolve into something more. As Thomas's pleas became more desperate, Rebecca's patience wore thin. She told him firmly that everything between them was over and that he needed to respect her marriage and her boundaries. Thomas, visibly shaken and unable to accept her rejection, attempted to persuade her to reconsider. Rebecca stood firm, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. Over the next several days, she avoided all contact with Thomas, hoping he would come to terms with her decision. She confided in Catherine, who listened with a heavy heart, knowing her husband's obsession had spiraled beyond control. Catherine promised to intervene, hoping to diffuse the situation before it escalated further. However, Thomas's fixation only deepened. He started appearing outside Rebecca's workplace, waiting for her in parking lots and leaving voicemails professing his love and anguish. Rebecca, feeling increasingly unsafe, decided to confront him one final time. They met at a secluded park on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes. Rebecca reiterated that their relationship was finished and that his behavior was unacceptable and frightening. She pleaded with him to seek help and move on. Thomas, unable to process her rejection, grew angry. He accused her of manipulating him, of leading him on, and then discarding him when it suited her. Rebecca, maintaining her composure despite her racing heart, insisted they part ways permanently. Unbeknownst to them, Catherine had followed Thomas to the park. She watched from behind a cluster of trees, her pulse quickening as she witnessed the confrontation unfold. She could see the desperation etched into Thomas's face and the resolve in Rebecca's eyes. As the argument intensified, Thomas's desperation morphed into rage. Rebecca's refusal to entertain his fantasies felt like a profound betrayal. He lashed out verbally, his words cruel and cutting. Rebecca, holding back tears, refused to be intimidated. Catherine, watching from her hiding spot, felt panic rising within her. She knew she had to intervene before the situation turned violent. She stepped out from behind the trees and called out to Thomas, her voice shaking. The sight of Catherine seemed to momentarily snap Thomas out of his fury. He turned to her, confusion and relief mingling in his expression. Rebecca, seizing the opportunity, walked away quickly, determined to put as much distance as possible between herself and Thomas. Catherine, now alone with her husband, tried to calm him down. She assured him they would find a way through this crisis, but deep inside, she knew their lives had been irrevocably altered. The confrontation had left Thomas in a state of profound turmoil. Rebecca's rejection, combined with Catherine's unexpected appearance, had shaken him to his core. He returned home that night, his mind a chaotic swirl of anger, betrayal, and despair. Catherine, sensing the storm raging within him, attempted to soothe his troubled thoughts, but Thomas remained unreachable. Over the following days, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He stopped going to work, spending his days obsessing over Rebecca's rejection and the perceived injustices he had suffered. Catherine, unable to penetrate the wall Thomas had built around himself, felt her own frustration and fear intensifying. She knew something had to give, but she wasn't prepared for the catastrophic turn of events that would soon unfold. Rebecca, meanwhile, was determined to move forward. She avoided all contact with Thomas, focusing on her work and her relationship with Eric. She hadn't disclosed the full extent of Thomas's obsession to her husband, fearing his reaction and the potential fallout. She hoped that by cutting all ties, Thomas would eventually accept the end of their arrangement and leave her alone. One evening, Rebecca returned home from her studio to find Thomas waiting outside her house. Her heart sank at the sight of him, and she braced herself for another confrontation. She approached cautiously, her voice firm as she told him to leave. Thomas, his eyes wild with desperation, begged for one last chance to explain himself. Rebecca, sensing the futility of engaging, tried to walk past him, but Thomas grabbed her arm. His grip was painful and unyielding, and Rebecca could see the madness flickering in his eyes. She struggled to break free, her voice rising as she demanded he release her. The commotion attracted the attention of a neighbor who stepped outside to investigate. Seeing the neighbor, Thomas released Rebecca and fled. Rebecca, shaken and terrified, thanked the neighbor and hurried inside. She immediately called Catherine, hoping to find some resolution without involving the police. Catherine, hearing the fear in Rebecca's voice, agreed to meet the following day to discuss how to handle Thomas's increasingly unstable behavior. The next day, Catherine met Rebecca at a quiet coffee shop. Rebecca, looking exhausted and tense, recounted the incident and her mounting fear for her safety. Catherine listened intently, her mind racing as she tried to formulate a plan. She promised Rebecca she would talk to Thomas and make him understand that their relationship was truly over. After the meeting, Catherine returned home to find Thomas in a state of agitation. She confronted him about the incident with Rebecca, her voice a mixture of anger and concern. Thomas, feeling cornered, lashed out at her, accusing her of siding with Rebecca and betraying him. The argument escalated, and Catherine, fearing for her own safety, retreated to their bedroom. That night, Thomas's thoughts turned darker. He couldn't accept that Rebecca had rejected him and that his own wife was against him. In his twisted reasoning, he believed the only way to resolve the situation was to eliminate the source of his pain. He decided that if he couldn't have Rebecca, no one could. On a cold, clear night, Thomas made his way to the Hart residence. He knew Eric was out of town, leaving Rebecca alone. He broke in through a side door and made his way to the bedroom where Rebecca lay sleeping. The sight of her, peaceful and unaware, fueled his rage and desperation. He grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and approached her bed, his mind filled with a chaotic mixture of love and hatred. Rebecca awoke to the sight of Thomas standing over her, the knife glinting in the dim light. She tried to scream, but Thomas covered her mouth, his grip strong and unrelenting. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, he plunged the knife into her chest, silencing her cries. As Rebecca's life slipped away, Thomas stood over her, his mind a haze of conflicting emotions. In the aftermath of the murder, Thomas fled the scene, his hands stained with Rebecca's blood. He returned home, where Catherine found him trembling and incoherent. She realized immediately what he had done, and in a moment of twisted loyalty, she decided to help him cover up the crime. The life they had built, the secrets they had kept, were all at stake. Catherine knew that if they were to survive, they needed to act quickly and decisively. Catherine, driven by a combination of fear and misguided loyalty, took control of the situation. She led Thomas to the bathroom, instructing him to remove his clothes and wash away the blood. Her mind raced with the urgency of their predicament. She knew they had to act swiftly to cover up the crime and protect their secret life. As Thomas stood under the hot shower, the water turning crimson around his feet, Catherine gathered his clothes and placed them in a garbage bag. She scrubbed the floors where he had walked, ensuring no trace of blood remained. Once Thomas was cleaned up, Catherine sat him down and forced him to recount every detail of what had happened. Despite his emotional turmoil, Thomas managed to provide a coherent account, his voice shaking with the weight of his actions. Catherine devised a plan. They needed to establish an alibi and dispose of any evidence linking them to the crime. She called a close friend, claiming that Thomas had been with her all evening, ensuring their alibi had external corroboration. Then she drove to a remote area outside of town, where she burned Thomas's blood-stained clothes and the murder weapon, praying the flames would consume any remaining evidence. When Rebecca's body was discovered the next morning, the police launched an immediate investigation. Detective Sarah Collins, a seasoned investigator known for her meticulous approach, took charge of the case. She interviewed everyone in the neighborhood, including the Chambers. Catherine's carefully crafted alibi held up under initial scrutiny, and Thomas, though visibly distressed, managed to avoid raising immediate suspicion. The investigation seemed to stall, with no concrete leads pointing toward the Chambers. Despite their initial success in evading the authorities, the psychological toll of the murder weighed heavily on both Thomas and Catherine. Thomas became increasingly paranoid, convinced that the police were closing in on him. He withdrew from friends and colleagues, isolating himself in a web of fear and regret. Catherine, while outwardly composed, felt the strain of their secret pressing down on her. She became hypervigilant, scrutinizing every interaction and behavior for signs of suspicion from those around them. The weeks following Rebecca's murder were a blur of tension and deception for the Chambers. Catherine assumed the role of stabilizer, managing Thomas's paranoia while ensuring their public facade remained intact. She monitored news reports for any updates on the investigation, relieved that the police appeared to have no solid leads. However, Catherine knew that maintaining their cover required more than just an alibi. They needed to create a narrative that would divert attention away from Thomas. She suggested to Thomas that he should appear more grief-stricken over Rebecca's death, to align with the community's collective mourning and deflect any potential suspicion. At social gatherings and community vigils, Thomas played the part of the devastated friend. He spoke of Rebecca with a mixture of fondness and sorrow, his eyes often welling with tears. Eric, shattered and desperate for answers, seemed to appreciate Thomas's empathy, never suspecting his friend's involvement in his wife's death. Thomas's mental state deteriorated further. His guilt manifested in nightmares and hallucinations. He started drinking heavily, seeking solace in alcohol, but finding only temporary escape. Catherine, fearing he might confess in a drunken stupor, kept a close watch on him, often staying awake late into the night to ensure he didn't leave the house. One evening, as Thomas sat slumped over a glass of whiskey, he broke down completely. He confessed to Catherine that he couldn't live with the guilt any longer, that he needed to come clean. Catherine, panicked, tried to calm him down, reminding him of everything they stood to lose. Desperate to stabilize the situation, Catherine suggested they take a brief trip out of town. They traveled to a remote cabin in the mountains, hoping the change of scenery would help Thomas regain some semblance of peace. The isolation provided temporary respite, allowing them to strategize their next steps without the constant pressure of the investigation looming over them. During their time at the cabin, Catherine reinforced the importance of maintaining their secrecy. She coached Thomas on how to handle police questioning and public interactions, drilling him until he could respond without hesitation. Upon returning to Clearwater Bay, the Chambers resumed their lives with renewed determination. Thomas, though still haunted by his actions, managed to present a more stable front. Catherine continued managing their interactions with the community, ensuring they remained above suspicion. However, cracks in their facade were beginning to show. Friends and neighbors noticed Thomas's increased drinking and erratic behavior, and whispers about his possible involvement in Rebecca's death began to circulate. Catherine, ever vigilant, worked to quash the rumors, but she knew their time was running out. As the police investigation continued, new evidence emerged that pointed toward inconsistencies in Thomas's alibi. Detective Collins interviewed the Chambers separately, noting discrepancies in their stories. Catherine's carefully rehearsed alibi held up under scrutiny, and Thomas's emotional state seemed consistent with that of a grieving friend. However, Collins's instincts told her there was more to the story. As weeks passed, forensic analysis of Rebecca's phone records revealed a series of increasingly desperate text messages from Thomas, indicating his obsession with her. Collins brought Thomas in for further questioning, pressing him on the inconsistencies in his alibi and the nature of his relationship with Rebecca. Thomas, struggling to maintain his composure, stuck to the story Catherine had coached him on, but his nervousness and evasive answers only heightened the detective's suspicions. The turning point came when the neighbor who had witnessed the confrontation outside Rebecca's house came forward with their testimony. They had seen Thomas's car parked near the Hart residence on the night of the murder and remembered his agitated behavior. This testimony, combined with the forensic evidence and Thomas's erratic behavior, was enough for the police to obtain a search warrant for the Chambers' home. During the search, investigators found remnants of burned fabric in their fireplace and traces of blood that had seeped into the floorboards despite Catherine's thorough cleaning. This damning evidence, coupled with witness testimony and phone records, painted a clear picture of Thomas's guilt. The net was closing in on the Chambers, and Catherine realized their carefully constructed facade was about to crumble completely. As the evidence against Thomas mounted, Detective Collins prepared to make her move. She brought Thomas in for another round of questioning, this time with a different approach. She laid out all the evidence they had gathered, the phone records, the witness testimonies, the forensic findings. Thomas, cornered and overwhelmed, began to crack under the pressure. Collins pressed harder, suggesting that if Thomas came clean, he might receive a more lenient sentence. Thomas, unable to handle the weight of his guilt and the relentless questioning, finally broke down. He confessed to killing Rebecca, describing his obsession, the confrontation, and the moment he lost control. However, in his confession, Thomas also implicated Catherine, revealing her role in covering up the crime. He described how she had helped him clean up, dispose of evidence, and craft an alibi. Collins, sensing the opportunity to obtain the full story, had Catherine brought in for questioning as well. Confronted with Thomas's confession, Catherine initially denied any involvement, but as Collins detailed the evidence in Thomas's account, Catherine realized there was no escape. Her carefully constructed lies had finally unraveled. She admitted to helping Thomas, explaining that she had acted out of misguided loyalty and fear of losing everything they had built. The trial of Thomas and Catherine Chambers captivated Clearwater Bay and the surrounding region. The courtroom was packed with reporters and onlookers eager to witness the conclusion of the tragic tale. Thomas, charged with first-degree murder, and Catherine, charged with accessory to murder and obstruction of justice, both entered guilty pleas. Thomas was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Catherine, despite her significant role in the cover-up, received a lighter sentence due to her cooperation with the investigation and her previously clean record. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 8. Eric Hart, left to piece together the fragments of a shattered life, found some measure of solace in the justice served, but continued to grieve the loss of his beloved wife, knowing that the people he had trusted most had destroyed everything he held dear.